And I'd like to welcome you to the fourth program of our 2024 Islesboro Forum Speaker Series. We're delighted to see as many people as we do. Not that this is an overflow crowd, but with the incidence of COVID, we thought some people would be a little bit hesitant. So you're brave, you're healthy, and I hope you stay that way. And it's a very exciting topic, so I'm glad that we have as many of you as we do in person. But we will be recording also, and be sure to let your friends know who might have stayed away that the recording will be posted probably in about 5 or 6 days. So think about that. Okay, I have a few general introductory remarks just to set your expectations. We'll be asking our speaker to speak about 25 to 30 minutes. After that, he'll take Q&A. And as I said, we will be recording and posting it later. We have a person who was absolutely key and instrumental in arranging for our speaker to do the in-depth introduction. But I'll just say, when I first met Hunter, was it 3 years ago? This has been in the gestation for a good 3 years. I was extremely impressed with his focus and background and expertise in the area that he's going to be talking on. So we're very fortunate on our small island to have this brought to us basically from the heart of Washington and the environs. I will say that it's now time for me to turn this over to Mark and introduce Hunter Stiles, our speaker, properly. Thank you.
Well, Gail, I would say that all good things take time, right? And here we are. And speaking of time, as I see masks around this room, I'm sort of transported back to the beginning of all this. We all know where it came from. And in a way, that'll be a metaphor for us tonight, because we're going to be transported from this little sliver of granite in the North Atlantic some 9,000 miles away to island chains in the South China Sea. And here China is asserting claims, territorial claims, that fly in the face of international law. And the stakes really could not be greater. Beneath the surface of the waters lie vast oil and gas reserves. Within these waters, abundant fisheries. And when you think about the shipping that transits across this region, some $3.5 trillion of trade annually. And not to forget Formosa, of course, Taiwan Semiconductor. Taiwan Semiconductor, as we all know, is basically fueling global innovation. So China, with the largest naval and Coast Guard fleet on the planet, is projecting power to subjugate other nations in the region. And countering this from distant shores is an ongoing challenge. Now, fortunately, in our engine room, we have rising talent, exemplified by Hunter, who's here with us today. And I'll delve into his bio, but just briefly, as you've seen, he's a maritime strategist working directly with the Secretary of the Navy. And if I may, I'll just have a look in here. His portfolio includes maritime statecraft, maritime competition, below armed conflict, Title X mission of the Navy. I have no idea what that is. Maybe we'll find out. And other priority initiatives. Outside the Pentagon, Hunter is project director of the U.S. Naval Institute's Maritime Counterinsurgency Project, a fellow with the U.S. Naval War College, and a fellow with Navy League Center for Maritime Strategy. I wouldn't want to come up against you in a 20, Hunter, I tell you. Having seriously outgunned. And my gosh, you've received accolades for your publications, prizes, just to name a few of them. One on the South China Sea, one, Why We Defend Free Seas. Another one, Win Without Fighting. Boy, isn't that great. You'll see on the bottom, we have a little note saying that views that you are expressed don't necessarily represent official positions. Okay, so everybody's got that? Now, Hunter is here not because of me. He's here because of Andrew Pipers. Put your hand up, Andrew. And Ann, who's here in the front, and Hunter's mother, right here, Denise. Longtime family friends. And, you know, that's what makes this place so special, is the people and the friends and the generational relations that are further cemented here. And that's what's so great about this place. And Hunter, I had the distinct pleasure of chatting with you over the past few summers, and I just wanted to share some of my learnings with all of you. So please join me, everybody, in welcoming Hunter Stiers. Hunter?
Well, thank you, Mark and Gail, both for having me here. Thank you for that generous introduction, and want to give a shout out to Reed Hausman, who is here, who I first. Long-time member of this community, who I first benefited from his mentorship and insights when we were trying to decide whether I was 6 or 7, and we started off with Woodes Rogers' A Cruising Voyage Around the World. So very important first step in my development as a maritime strategist. So thank you all very much for having me. It is a privilege to speak to you today about a vital strategic challenge facing the United States and our like-minded allies and partners in the Western Pacific, namely China's maritime insurgency against the rule of international law and the freedom of the sea. Just briefly, as Mark mentioned, I'm here. This is just me talking. This is I am on vacation, so not an official engagement by any means. But to begin with, in terms of some of the recent developments in terms of this work, this maritime insurgency, maritime counterinsurgency concept is a constituent component of the overarching concept that the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, has put forward of maritime statecraft. Which is a new approach essentially encompassing how do we build and then how do we employ comprehensive maritime power in pursuit of our national interests in peace and war. And so the Secretary first put this idea forward at the Harvard Kennedy School in this past September, so we're coming up on a year. And as part of the speech, he talked about the prototype implementation of maritime counterinsurgency by the 7th Fleet in an incident which we'll get to in a little bit about in April and May of 2020. And so holding this up as an example of what success looks like in maritime statecraft. So maritime statecraft, how do you build maritime power? How do you employ it? This is on the employ side, and in these kinds of competitive environments below the threshold of war. And then Mark mentioned the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project. So this is an effort that is coming out in the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard's professional journal, the Naval Institute Proceedings. Some real heavy hitters here in the maritime strategy world who have contributed to this. And the person who wrote the book the book that's on every ship and shore installation in the Navy on China's maritime strategy. One of the preeminent theorists of sea power of the 21st century. The former vice chief of the Philippines Navy, just to name a few. The guy who wrote the 1980s maritime strategy that defeated the Soviet Union. Really, really incredible people who have rogered up to contribute to this thinking. And you can access it. So usni.org/maritimecoin is where you can access these brilliant, people who are way smarter than me, their work on this concept. Which, just very briefly, the Chinese have very much noticed, and they don't like it, which is always a really good sign of success that you're onto something. Is when first of all when they notice, hey, this could be a real problem for us, and then when they actually start to potentially start shooting darts at it, which they have. So, diving into the substance, when we think about China, We generally think about, and we hear, what grabs most of the headlines, most of the attention, are a couple of big things. We hear a lot about China's development of anti-access and area denial capabilities, so long-range anti-ship missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles. We hear a lot about their development of their blue water navies, capital ships like carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. What you don't hear about in the headlines nearly as much is China's forcible coercion of local Southeast Asian civilian mariners. It bears repeating. Half the world's fishing fleet operates in the South China Sea. More than almost about 4 million people depend on access to the South China Sea for their daily livelihoods. And these civilian mariners are being subjected to a concerted campaign of intimidation and harassment. Chinese maritime law enforcement, that is the China Coast Guard, big air quotes around the China Coast Guard being a real Coast Guard, and the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. They will interfere with the lawful operations of these local civilian mariners, and then they will actively interdict attempts by their respective national maritime law enforcement agencies endeavoring to protect these civilians. In boarding operations, Chinese maritime law enforcement, the China Coast Guard, the Maritime Militia, they will steal fishermen's catch. They will confiscate radio and navigational equipment that is essential to, a lot of seafaring people here. People understand, how challenging it is to safely navigate, congested waters in a small craft without that kind of equipment. They will go and they will steal it. For at least 10 years that we know about Chinese Coast Guard forces, they will kidnap Vietnamese fishermen for ransom. Wow. Chinese boarding parties, they will pour gasoline into the drinking water supplies of Vietnamese fishermen to force them to return to shore. And Chinese forces, they'll not only steal equipment and steal vessels, they will ram and sink people too. And we saw this in the case of the Philippines in June of 2019, when essentially a Chinese maritime militia vessel ran over in the middle of the night a Filipino fishing vessel, sent everybody into the water. And fundamentally, the law of the sea is, everyone here knows, the fundamental precepts. The law of the sea is ultimately very simple. You try not to hurt people. You share the water space. You try not to hurt people. And when you see someone in trouble and you're in a position to help, you help. And what did the Chinese vessel do? They drove away, hit and run, without leaving everybody in the water to drown. The only reason no one died is there was a Vietnamese boat nearby that fulfilled its international obligations. So it's really hard, when you say all of these things out loud, it's really hard to avoid the conclusion that this is a form of state piracy. I mean, the Barbary pirates come to mind. And actually, come to think of it, the Philippines recently said, they've been contending with the China Coast Guard off Second Thomas Shoal recently, that they've been starting to use that language themselves. So what's going on here? What do we make of these kinds of barbaric actions? What you're seeing play out in each of these these cumulative, ship-to-ship, boat-to-boat interactions, you are seeing a contest play out between two pretty diametrically opposed visions of how sovereignty should be adjudicated in the maritime domain. On one side, you have the long-standing principle of international law of the freedom of the sea. This has been codified in international law through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. And on the other side, you have China's own hierarchical and Sinocentric vision, an authoritarian vision of basically a closed sea, which is really well encapsulated, and their thinking on this is really well encapsulated by this phrase that they use to describe their maritime claims of blue national soil. So I think in terms of what we're talking about here, I think this map from The Economist really does a good job of illustrating it. So you see in the light blue, you see essentially if UNCLOS were applied, how essentially the waters would be divided up, the waters of the South China Sea would be divided up. Essentially it treats all states as, they're coming at this from essentially equal standpoint. Everybody, whatever, the seas are open to everyone. What rights countries have at sea is based on what they own on land. So essentially you see it would be divided up into these exclusive economic zones of the various coastal states of the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, and essentially equitably, based on adjacent landward holdings. And in red, you see China's claim, their pretension to indisputable sovereignty over 90% of the South China Sea, which they are claiming, as that phrase implies, of blue national soil, they are claiming the South China Sea as if it were land, not as if it's sea, as if you can stick a flag in it and build a fence around it. And so this goes against the last several hundred years of international law, which has been based on this broader principle of the freedom of the sea. So continuing with, I like to continue to break this down. I refer to this as kind of the prime factorization of the conflict. So between these two diametrically opposed visions, we're equitable distribution of the resources in the waters of the South China Sea versus essentially the Chinese trying to disenfranchise all their weaker neighbors of their rights under international law. We are having an argument about who governs in this body of water among the people who live and dwell and work there. Well, when we talk about who governs, what does that really mean? When we talk about governance, really we are talking about how do you manifest political will into action? And generally speaking, we manifest political will into action through law. So you're having a fight about who governs, you're really having a disagreement about whose laws are in force. What does it mean for a law to be enforced? It means that the law is accepted, and more importantly, it is adhered to in practice by the civilian population that law aspires to govern. So you're having an argument about who governs, which means you're really having an argument about whose laws are enforced. And ultimately, the name of the game, it will ultimately come down to whose laws do the civilians follow. This is both a metric of success as well as a mechanism of victory. Generally speaking, there's two approaches as to how you wage one of these battles of legal regimes. So there's the sequential approach and there's the cumulative approach. So the sequential approach we generally refer to as something like conventional warfare. You have your the two belligerents, the two sides, they get out their militaries, they have a fight, one side wins, the other side loses or is pushed back or is destroyed, and then in sequence, after the battle is over, whoever wins that fight then in sequence, after it's over, imposes their laws on the civilian population. So fight first, then impose your laws. Now, say one of those two belligerents decides, I'm not sure I'm going to win that fight. Say I've got 10 guys and they've got 100 guys. I think we know who wins that gunfight. So if you're them, are you going to sign up to go and get into a fight with someone who is much more powerful than you? No, you will decline battle. And instead, you have the option to instead focus all your efforts on imposing your own laws on the civilian population in question while declining that battle and without first fighting and defeating your opposite numbers in open battle. So sequential way we refer to as conventional warfare. We generally refer to this cumulative campaign, this cumulative approach as an insurgency. So, and I think it's helpful to, in terms of explaining this, imagine you're living in a neighborhood, you're minding your own business, and then these guys show up. And they decide they really like your neighborhood too, and they decide it's now going to be their neighborhood. It actually doesn't matter, I should note, who these guys actually are. They can be a street gang, they can be a mafia syndicate, they can be a drug cartel, they can be a terrorist group, an insurgent group. It's all the same basic MO. And they decide that nobody gets to operate a business, nobody gets to safely walk down the street, nobody gets to safely go patronize a business without first somehow acknowledging the authority of the gang, whoever this group is. Now, the law says you don't have to listen to these guys at all. But now imagine, say that your local police department is a bit overtasked, and they've only got a couple of police cruisers, and so they're concerned about this too. So they'll drive that police cruiser through the neighborhood. But say if they're only there 10 minutes a day, and whenever they drive through, the local street gang goes and lies low. But then as soon as the cop turns the corner, they're like, back to business, we're in charge, you have to give us protection money. You are left with this very uncomfortable choice of whose laws do you follow. So a couple key dynamics to keep in mind as we're thinking about this battle of legal regimes. So the first is that if the decisive question is whose laws do the civilians follow, it therefore follows that it's actually the civilians who ultimately decide the winner of the contest between those two belligerents. So of those different relationships, the relationship of each belligerent to the civilians in question is going to be a lot more important ultimately than the actions taken by the belligerents just directly against each other. And the Chinese in the South China Sea, they understand this, and this is why they have spent such time and energy and resources on forcing their own domestic laws, made in Beijing, on the civilian populations who spend the most time in the areas that they wish to make their own. I think this really illustrates this very well, where you see in the foreground, you see the rigging of the traditional Filipino fishing boat. Here's the big scary China Coast Guard cutter with the water cannon on, and note the empty horizon. If this is your reality as a fisherman, day in and day out, and no one is coming to save you, whose laws do you follow? One point I like to make is that we talked about protection money with that street gang back there. The Chinese don't call it protection money; they call it joint development of offshore resources in the South China Sea. So, from the Chinese standpoint, this fundamentally makes sense. When you think about China's strategic canon, there's obviously a much greater diversity than these particular two authors of Sun Tzu and Mao Zedong, but these are the two guys who everybody reads as the foundation of how they think about strategy. Sun Tzu, his number one precept is that it is always better to win either without fighting or without a pitched battle, before the other guy has gotten a chance to kind of get his army together and form ranks. So that's the highest form of strategy. Mao Zedong is the most successful insurgent in history. He took over a continent-sized country with insurgent guerrilla methods. So essentially what they have done, they have synthesized these two approaches and they have sent them out to sea. And they are applying them below the threshold of armed conflict. And this is part of why this is something that in the West we are less used to seeing. We are much used to more of those conventional approaches. So it's not new, but it feels new to us because we haven't seen it in this kind of domain and synthesized in this kind of way before. Now, a note on nomenclature. Occasionally people say, well, hang on a minute. We usually use the term insurgent to describe somebody like the Taliban, non-state actor. What do you mean a country can be an insurgent? What do you mean the world's second largest economy should be described in the same language as we would use for someone like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda in Iraq or someone like that? And really, what we are saying is states can be insurgents too. This is not the strategic logic that I laid out of a cumulative campaign that you decline battle against your opposite number and instead impose your laws on the civilian populations you're trying to say you're in charge of. You don't have to be a non-state actor in order to do that. That logic is open to anybody, and the logic, that strategy, does not care who employs it. There's lots of good examples from history of states using insurgent methods to advance their foreign policy. North Vietnam is a really good example. We think about there's a common misconception that the Viet Cong was a homegrown South Vietnamese movement. It wasn't. It was understood to be the vanguard of a North Vietnamese cross-border invasion of South Vietnam. It took orders from Hanoi. It was part of the North Vietnamese army. And then you see Iran. Iran has been very successful for about 40 years in using various kinds of insurgent approaches, either sponsoring insurgencies or actually using its own national forces as insurgents themselves in order to advance their foreign policy, and they have done reasonably well in this approach over the last 4 decades, not a moralistic statement, just in terms of how they've been doing in terms of the success of their strategy. Within that, those heavy hitters I put on the screen there in terms of the names of the people who are contributing to the project, there's a lot of interesting diversity of thought as to how you apply the insurgency counterinsurgency model to the South China Sea. There's the version where China is the insurgent against the prevailing international legal order of the freedom of the sea, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, of which the United States is the guarantor and therefore the counterinsurgent. You can scope down. Folks like Brian Clark talk about that it's more the Southeast Asian coastal states like the Philippines, like Vietnam, who are much more the counterinsurgent because they're the ones who implement international law in the final analysis. And then there's folks like I mentioned Rear Admiral Rommel Ong, who's the Vice Chief of the Philippines Navy. He's happy with those first two, but he's also open to scoping out and looking at China as an insurgent on grand scale against the rules-based international order itself. The point here is that just because a country is in possession of first-class military power doesn't mean it always has to act like one. So for the last few years, let's say we've started to evolve since then, which is a good thing. But the initial response for a long time by the United States to this kind of behavior was we would do these freedom of navigation operations. We'd take a large surface combatant, we would drive through a disputed area, and then we would leave. And so this is very helpful from its own standpoint because it is a form of cumulative campaign of our own, where we are basically saying, over time, no, we do not recognize China's disputed, these outlandish claims to indisputable sovereignty. You run into an issue in terms of that, so these are necessary, but they are insufficient. Because ultimately, when you drive your big surface combatant through a disputed area, the Chinese and the civilians will wave at you as you go by. And then once again, you're back over the horizon. It's like the street cop who, the police cruiser drives to the neighborhood, turns the corner, and then the Chinese are like, back to business, we're in charge. And this does not meaningfully affect civilian behavior nearly the way that we would need it to in order to have a strategic impact. And it also presents a certain other vulnerability in terms of, and this is everyone's favorite slide, the commander of the 7th Fleet, this is his favorite slide, he gets to be John Wayne. So think of this like, okay, before I move on, who recognizes the movie?
The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Well spotted, sir. If you want to understand the South China Sea, you got to watch The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. It really is instructive. It should be when you think about, so imagine here's the Duke walking into the saloon up against Lee Marvin, the black hat, who's been bullying Jimmy Stewart. If the Duke walks in and says, Lee, I really don't like what you're doing to Jimmy Stewart here. I think you ought to leave. It's really not the best. It's really not the best approach or getting ahead of myself a little bit here. So the challenge here, so backing up to the freedom of navigation operations, we drive through the disputed area. The Chinese wave at us as we go by. They also follow us through. They don't necessarily have to do anything particularly disruptive. They just get on the radio and they say, we would like you to leave, please. And of course, we're always planning to leave. So getting back to our saloon, Duke walks in, says, Lee, I don't like what you're doing to Gerald Jimmy Stewart here. I think you ought to leave. If Lee then turns and says, well, Duke, I think you ought to leave. It's not the strongest posture for John Wayne to say, you know what? I was just leaving. And of course, this is inherent. We were always planning to leave, but inadvertently, this is an inadvertent byproduct. Now, I would also point out, in terms of getting back to why The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is really the documentary you need to watch to understand the South China Sea. Who are the key people in this relationship? It's not the Duke versus Lee Marvin. The decisive people, it's Jimmy Stewart, and it's all the other people watching in the saloon. They are going to be the people who decide the outcome of this confrontation. Now, why does this matter from a strategic standpoint? To begin with, we are most appropriate, we're here on an island. Well, the United States is an island power. We stand at the head of a maritime order. So our security, essentially, if we want to access the overwhelming majority of the world's population, the overwhelming majority of the world's markets, we have to go on or over the water. So our security and those of our key allies depends on freedom of the sea in order to assure our own commercial and military access to that overwhelming majority of the world's population. So think about if China is successful in the South China Sea. If they are able to undo the freedom of the sea and basically say those rules don't apply, and now basically we get to claim whatever areas of patches of ocean and stick a flag in it and claim it as ours. If they're able to do that, and then if they are successful at shifting a lot of trade between themselves and Europe ashore to the inland stretches of Eurasia, as they are trying to do through their One Belt, One Road program, what you're looking at is essentially, they're trying to create, is essentially what Napoleon tried and failed to do to Britain during the Napoleonic Wars, essentially a continental system. Essentially, they said, okay, Napoleon said, okay, all of Europe that's under my control, you may not trade with Britain. Now, Britain could still trade with the United States, they could trade with their empire in India and elsewhere, so their trade was not nearly as affected as Napoleon wished it were. In this particular instance, if you take this to where China seems to be trying to take it, we would not necessarily have that option because we are talking about the overwhelming majority of the world's population that lives outside North America. and specifically in Eurasia, which China seeks to dominate. Now, we talk about, okay, is China preparing for war? Yes. They are working on preparing themselves for a high-end confrontation that may or may not take place in the future. And at the same time, they are waging a parallel line of effort of they are doing their very best to prevail through these maritime insurgent approaches today without fighting, without escalating to that high-end confrontation. This is a dual-track strategy. And since they can win either way, essentially, we have a lot of talk in Washington about, everybody likes to present false choices. Do you prepare for this or do you prepare for that? We don't have the luxury of a choice. We must face down and confront both of these lines of effort, or we will face defeat. So, and essentially, so what this means is if we do not confront China's maritime insurgency, the very uncomfortable truth is the prospect that we actually won't need to worry about a shooting war at all, which is of course the primary focus of a lot of efforts in the Pentagon. If we don't figure out if we do not face them short of war today, we don't necessarily need to worry about a war because we will find that they will have won and we will have lost without a shot being fired at anger. So what do we do? A couple of historical case studies to guide our action. So first one is, so anyone here seen The Sand Pebbles with Steve McQueen? All right, we got one in the back. So this formation of the U.S. Navy, which was the forward deployed element in the Western Pacific from about the 1850s Matthew Perry opening Japan through to World War II. This is the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, the USS Augusta, during the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, where you see that big column of smoke. That's where the skyscrapers are now. So really quite something the way things have changed over the last almost 90 years. So during this period of time, Japan launches a full-scale invasion. In 1937, Japan launches this full-scale invasion of metropolitan China. And at the same time, as they are undertaking this very high-end war, they are also working below the threshold of war to try and force US and Western interests out of China without having to go to war with us, because they've already bitten off what turns out to be a lot more than they could chew. And so there's all these foreign powers in China, all these different foreign interests in terms of concessions and banks and these various foreign fleets. And so the Asiatic Fleet is a very, very small fleet. It's really primarily a diplomatic force rather than a war-fighting force at this juncture. But in the hands of a very capable four-star admiral by the name of Harry Yarnell, Admiral Yarnell deploys this very innovative strategy against this Japanese gray zone effort to force us out without having to go to war with us, and he is able to effectively stymie their efforts. And so even though the Asiatic Fleet is numerically completely outmatched, is out of date with ships that are as it's the next commander, Admiral Hart, used to say his ships were all old enough to vote. Nevertheless, they are able to successfully deter Imperial Japan from successfully consummating their gray zone aggression against U.S. and Western interests, despite this overmatch. The critical enabler of Admiral Yarnell's strategy is he essentially he radically devolves authority down to the local on-scene commander. One destroyer captain talks about, he sends him off to a port that the Japanese have just invaded. And he says, "What are my orders, Admiral?" And the Admiral says, "Protect American interests." And he says, "Well, what does that mean, sir?" And he says, "Protect American interests." And so, essentially, you're counting on your local people and your local commanders to be able to carry this strategy forward and potentially take fairly assertive steps. And you are trusting their judgment and you're going to back them up. Now, what's interesting about this is we think of trusting your subordinates as an inherently kind of risky thing to do. It is actually gain maximizing, risk limiting. Because as this destroyer captain described, if you do something a little bit extreme and it works, you're a duke. If you do something extreme and it doesn't work, if it blows up into a serious incident, then the admiral always has the option of yanking you out. And then say, look, this is a local guy, he made a mistake, and let's work this out. And you actually see this, the Japanese more or less using a similar approach to us in part because they have a really screwed up civil military situation where the government in Tokyo doesn't know that their military is actually doing various things like invading the Spratly Islands in 1939. What winds up happening is, when the Japanese actually sink one of our ships, and essentially this was the action of a local commander to essentially go and bomb the USS Panay in December 1937, the commander of the fleet, of the Japanese fleet in China actually basically says, this was not our idea, and I'm going to resign. And Admiral Yarnell actually has to go tell the State Department in Tokyo, hey, this is the only reasonable guy in China right now. Please don't let him resign. So very interesting, escalation management dynamic here. Now, this does require that your local force be backed up with a higher end warfighting force, that's the Pacific Fleet in California and Hawaii. But ultimately, this approach, there's a point where the Japanese, they really escalate their gray zone efforts against us. The Asiatic Fleet counter-escalates to match them, and then the Japanese ultimately de-escalate, having failed to achieve their objective. And so ultimately, the reason why we have to stop doing this is basically the fall of France in 1940 totally disrupts the global strategic calculus. And ultimately, that's the point when the next commander of the Asiatic Fleet says, okay, we have to get ready for war. War is going to come, and that means we have to start training up for that. So, but very interesting period of time that we can learn from as we are sending forces to contend with these kinds of challenging and ambiguous situations. And then the second case study I would bring us to is the combined action in Vietnam by the U.S. Marine Corps. So more traditional counterinsurgency environment. Essentially, what you have is the Marines noticed that there was this South Vietnamese home defense militia that was getting basically no attention from the government, and they said, these guys have a lot of attributes which could be very helpful in terms of securing the South Vietnamese population against the efforts of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army to impose North Vietnamese and communist rule on them. So what they came up with was they said, we're going to take a very small group of Marines, we are going to put them with a much larger group of this popular defense, a popular front home defense militia, and essentially have each of them create this combined unit that with each component raising the overall effectiveness of each other and the overall combined unit. So essentially, we bring all the cool, our 12 guys, we bring all the cool toys, we bring the logistics chains, we bring medevacs, they can call in artillery support, they can call in airstrikes, they have helicopter medevacs, all of those things that the popular forces on their own could only dream of. The popular forces, they have people, they have a lot more people than we were bringing to the table. They have local knowledge. We all know, you think about it in the maritime environment, the importance of local knowledge in navigating, kind of complicated terrain. And they bring the determination of they are defending their homes, and that is going to make them that much more determined against foes who are coming from elsewhere. And so what this ultimately allows the Marines to do is they wage a counterinsurgency by fighting like the insurgents. And they are able, this is something that Jeffrey Till, this incredible theorist wrote a book called Sea Power Guide to the 21st Century, which I highly recommend. What he talks about, and what he talks about in his article for the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project, is that the most successful counterinsurgents in history, the way is not to go and say, I'm going to take my conventional battalion and sweep through an area, this is what the U.S. Army wanted to do at the time, and what Westmoreland ultimately prevailed in doing, and basically 800 guys walk through a village, and then they leave. Of course, if your threat is 12 guys with guns, they know who's going to win the gunfight against the 800 guys, so they skip town. And then that 800 guy force, they are in that particular village for maybe 3 hours a month. Getting back to, if you're the civilians, and the good guys are here for 3 hours a month, and the bad guys are here the rest of the time, whose laws do you follow? So this approach, the Marines are there all the time, working in these combined units with the South Vietnamese in their homes, basically. And as Jeffrey Till makes the point, the most successful counterinsurgents in history, they will leverage they will adapt to, even adopt the methods of the insurgent opponents, and then marshal their superior resources to beat the insurgents at their own game. The results in Vietnam, of a relative, like only 2,200 Marines actually wind up being involved in this, but they wind up protecting about 500,000 South Vietnamese civilians. They suffer proportionally half of the U.S. casualties as the forces that are doing the 800 guys walk through the village approach, the search and destroy approach. They inflict proportionally twice the casualties on the enemy as the search and destroy approach. And they have measurably higher degrees of civilian population security in the places where these people are assigned. And at the same time, instead of, they did the math, if Westmoreland had been a little bit smarter and applied this approach to the Vietnam War, nationwide, you would have been able to protect the entire country with, I think it was something less than 100,000 troops instead of the 500,000 we ultimately committed to the fight. And so maximum economy of force that makes it that much more politically sustainable. Now, you look at what this approach, now, Westmoreland didn't want to do it, and he succeeded in not doing it, and we know the result. If you want a version where this was the main effort, you look at the counter-ISIL campaign between 2014 and 2018 or so, where essentially we brought the cool toys. You had whether the Syrian Democratic Forces or the various Iraqi forces, and it's one of the most successful counterinsurgent campaigns in history. And ISIL's not really a thing anymore in nearly the way that it was when it showed up on the scene in 2014. So, thinking about how we apply this to the South China Sea today, so a couple of kind of things to keep in mind. As long as China, so to begin with, as long as China continues to believe that its interests are best pursued short of war, we think of ourselves as being really constrained in terms of what we are allowed to do. Well, guess what? It also means that they're constrained too. And that is something that is very useful. And so in terms of their ability to compel their opposite numbers, that is going, there are opportunities there. This also means that essentially if you're going to base your strategy on deterrence by punishment of if you cross this line, I'm going to blow you up, that is going to be vulnerable to the kind of subtle revisionist attacker that China has been over the last few years. And that is, whereas you want to combine that threat of if you cross this line, I'll blow you up, with the person who's at the line saying, don't you dare cross this line, and I'm going to move to block you if you do. So essentially what you need to figure out how to do is you need to protect local civilian mariners from China's depredations on their international legal rights. You have to figure out how to establish and maintain a form of credible permanence in the eyes of both the civilian populations as well as the governments that represent them. That in order to be politically sustainable, you have to use the greatest degree of economy of force as you can. Between the United, particularly on the U.S. side, and working with your allies, really, it's the by, with, and through approach with your local partners as to the greatest degree that you can, and that allows you to be ideally indefinitely sustainable over the long term. And at the same time, you can't neglect the possibility of you have to make sure you have a credible warfighting deterrence posture, so that if they do decide to run over that force that is out on the line, you are able to respond decisively and defeat that effort. So in terms of the force design, what we're talking about between the United States and our allies is figuring out how do you add the persistent low-end presence to the legacy model of periodic high-end presence. So you need the the smaller, more risk-worthy units supported by agile logistics. There's an interesting, don't have a slide on it, I really ought to make one, about the Cod Wars, an interesting, basically a series of grazing confrontations between the British and Iceland from the 50s to the 70s. You think about the Icelandic Coast Guard versus the mighty Royal Navy. When the Royal Navy deploys 22 high-end anti-submarine warfare frigates backed by air support, and the Icelandic Coast Guard has about 6 ships, which are converted trawlers and icebreakers and whalers, and who wins? Iceland does. And part of this is that when you're in an environment where, in this case, it's 2 NATO allies kind of going at it over fishing rights, and the British are like, this does not rise to the level where we are going to blow up the Icelandic Coast Guard, even though we could do that in 5 minutes. This is an area where the Icelandic Coast Guard, those trawlers and whalers and icebreakers, they are very sturdy. And so when the name of the game is you're playing bumper boats, some of these higher-end warships, anti-submarine frigate, it's designed to go find the Soviet submarines. Soviet submarine's not really trying to collide with you. You are trying to avoid the enemy weapon rather than necessarily, essentially, go bumper to bumper in a way where you're literally bumper to bumper. And so, the Royal Navy suffers a significant amount of damage to its anti-submarine force, whereas the Icelandic Coast Guard, these are tubby little trawlers and they can take it. And so, that kind of quality in terms of from a naval architecture standpoint, that takes on a greater priority than it does with a standard, a warship that is going to be looking to engage at range. And then at the same time, you need to figure out what is your higher end covering force that is closer to those vessels which are able to engage from range in order to deter that kind of kinetic attack. I will. I'll close with just a brief précis of the first prototype implementation, which I mentioned the Secretary talked about in his speech at Harvard. So essentially, starting in April 2020, you had the Malaysians had chartered a survey ship to go and explore for hydrocarbons in what international law says is their rightful exclusive economic zone, so within 200 nautical miles of their coast. And the Chinese decided, because this is inside that ridiculous claim of the 9-dash line, that they would essentially try and coerce them into stopping that. So they essentially put together their own a task force of a survey ship, several warships, Coast Guard, and maritime militia to come and intimidate the Malaysians. And they start doing their own survey. They start crowding into the Malaysian chartered survey ship. And so there's concern that the Malaysians will stop what they're doing and that they will cede the field to China. And so this is actually appropriate that we're dealing with a certain resurgence of COVID here. This is, of course, in the early days of COVID. And so one of the first people to reach out after the publication of the first article in the Naval Institute Proceedings, which put this idea forward, then Rear Admiral Fred Kacher, at the time the commander of Task Force 76, he basically goes and says, hey, let's figure out what we can do about this. And so essentially what he does is he puts together the forces that he has in hand. He has an amphibious assault ship, the USS America, which is the first ship actually to deploy the stealth F-35 fighter. He gets a couple of our cruisers and destroyers, and he gets a cooperative deployer in an Australian frigate, the HMS Parramatta. And they go and they show up on scene to basically show support for this Malaysian survey ship. Now, remember what we were talking about in terms of the freedom of navigation operations of the MO prior to this time of we drive through and then we leave. And this is the concern, that this is what's going to happen. And Admiral Kacher takes his force and he doesn't do that. He sticks around. Now, starts out with the capital ships, and of course capital ships are really busy, so they can stay for around a week. And then, but again, they are persisting close in to that Malaysian survey ship, and what's very interesting is the Chinese response, where previously they've been kind of bullying the Malaysians and pushing them around. When the Chinese Foreign Ministry gets asked about, hey, what's up with the standoff in the South China Sea, they are noticeably de-escalatory. And they're like, there's no standoff in the South China Sea. The situation in the South China Sea is improving. Interesting. So eventually the big ships have to rotate out. And initially there's here we go again. Here's the U.S. coming through, and then we drive away, and same old story. But then Admiral Kacher has, getting back to the kind of persistent low-end presence kind of thing, he has these two littoral combat ships, these smaller warships, which are rotationally forward deployed to Singapore. And for the first time, he had two of them in theater at the time. And so he starts rotating them through. There's the survey ship off in the distance. And this is coupled with press statements by both himself, his boss, Vice Admiral Mers, the commander of the 7th Fleet, and his boss, Admiral Aquilino, who was at the time the commander of the Pacific Fleet, making very clear that these operations, that they are connected, that they are focused on supporting our partner in Malaysia, and that and Admiral Aquilino was very, very clear. He said that we would stand with regional friends and partners to resist coercion and oppose unlawful claims that the Chinese Communist Party must stop end its practice of bullying Southeast Asians out of their offshore oil, gas, and fisheries. Millions of people depend on these resources for their livelihoods. And then Admiral Mers talks about how that the United States, in a follow-up operation by another littoral combat ship, this also being the first one to deploy with this new anti-ship missile, the naval strike missile you can see on the bow there, again, steaming alongside the survey ship, the West Capella. And Admiral Mers made the point, this was the first public statement by the United States that the U.S. supports the efforts of our allies and partners in the lawful pursuit of their economic interests. We had never said that before. And so what's very interesting is there was concern about whether or not the Malaysians would stick it out. In the face of all of this pressure, the Malaysians do stick it out. And they conclude their survey. They complete all of their planned work as previously scheduled, despite a lot of Chinese pressure. There's also a very interesting follow-up where that same littoral combat ship, the Gabriel Giffords, you see in the foreground here. There's a Chinese survey ship, which about a month later, after the Malaysians complete their work and the Chinese withdraw from the Malaysian EEZ, another different Chinese survey ship shows up in the Vietnamese exclusive economic zone, and so people start wondering: are the Chinese about to run the same play on Vietnam? Of course, the Vietnamese Coast Guard responds very quickly, and then here comes the Gabriel Giffords. And we put up the helicopter, we take a number of pictures, including this one, and we put them on the internet. And we talk about, here we are, exercising a persistent presence in the vicinity, near this survey ship. And what's very interesting is the Chinese survey ship goes home without doing that intrusive survey like they had just done with Malaysia. So, and then what's interesting is in terms of the follow-on from these operations over the next several months, you see three major regional powers shift their stance on the South China Sea to take a more assertive stance in standing up themselves against Chinese coercion. So you see Malaysia start lodging protests against Chinese actions at the UN, something they very rarely do. You see Indonesia undertake a large-scale naval exercise in the South China Sea, which they almost never do. And within a year, under Duterte, probably one of the most China-friendly leaders in all of Southeast Asia at the time, you see the Philippine Coast Guard getting their vessels out on the street, and the beginning of what has continued in essentially this remarkable campaign by the Philippines to expose the Chinese maritime militia. This is that you see Whitsun Reef, which happened. This is within a year of that in 2021. And that has continued to this day as the Philippine Coast Guard has taken a brilliant stand in standing up to Chinese coercion and aggression and their maritime insurgency. So, so essentially, it gets back to close out with The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance again. When you think about that film itself, what ultimately needs to happen in terms of the way you do it. If we're John Wayne, it's about how do we support Jimmy Stewart in standing up for himself to Lee Marvin, which, of course, is the plot of the film. So I look forward to, with that, let me turn it over to questions and discussion, and then I hope everyone will go home and watch The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
And just fascinating. Would you do us a favor and look back to the map of the South China Sea, because that is so informative there. And the second Thomas Shoal, that has been an absolute hot spot. So on that. And Philippines had a joint defense treaty with the United States dating back to the 1950s. So, you got this flashpoint right there, real time. What might trigger that? And what are our obligations opposite the Philippines in the most actively contested area of this region.
Well, I'd say that getting back to this question of how do you build that, basically a combined maritime posture with that persistent presence, not necessarily the super high-end, Aegis missile-toting warships, but who is essentially, if the U.S. Navy is right now really structured to be a very highly effective SWAT team, that what we need is the beat cop. And so this is a point that Admiral Ong made in his article for the Maritime Coin Project in the August 2023 issue of Proceedings. Admiral Ong being the retired Vice Chief of the Philippines Navy, which is that he essentially applies one of the most significant theorists of counterinsurgency, a guy named David Galula, a French officer who fought in Algeria and into China, and put together a lot of lessons from him at the tactical level. But he made the point that the way that you essentially the way you gain the support of the population is through the support of an active minority. And so he said a lot of Southeast Asia is probably going to be hesitant to get off the fence. In terms, they are always looking, by nature, this is, deeply embedded in their strategic culture to basically not be asked to choose and try very hard not to choose between the United States and China, as the phrase goes. He says, but you have the United States, you have Japan, and you have the Philippines, and that might actually be all you need. And so you look at the operations of Second Thomas Shoal, and you look at essentially
Can you point out where that is? It's in the Spratlys?
it's in the Spratlys. So essentially, sure,
Yeah. That's ground zero right now, right?
yes. This is about.
So that's it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What's the white area that just to the left of what you just pointed at?
So that is the area, kind of in the centerpiece, which is actually beyond the exclusive economic zone of any of the coastal states, and that would essentially that is high seas between them. So the way you look at the Philippines Coast Guard and the Philippines Bureau of Fisheries, and then working in conjunction with the United States and other allies and partners, what it has been very encouraging to see essentially this approach being taken and implemented. And I'd say it's particularly encouraging also. I mentioned Admiral Kacher, he wasn't the first admiral, wasn't the first naval officer. He was the first person to reach out after the publication of this idea in an article called "The South China Sea Needs a Coin Toss," and he is now the commander of the 7th Fleet. And so I would argue, this is me talking, you have to be careful here, because so our office is not involved in, we are the man, train, and equip side. We're not involved in the, in terms of actually how you employ the fleet, in terms of the role of the Secretary of the Navy. Again, speaking only for myself here. I would argue you are seeing a version of this approach being implemented now, where essentially you are seeing, and over the last few years, I think with growing degrees of success, where you see, in terms of building that combined force, where you're seeing more littoral combat ships have now been rotationally forward deployed to Singapore. You are seeing the fleet continuing, some fleet continuing to get out on the street in terms of, and looking to exercise that persistent presence. And then, most importantly of all, you have the Philippines Coast Guard, the Philippines Navy, and the Philippines Bureau of Fisheries supporting Philippine civilian mariners out there exercising their rights. Your Second Thomas Shoal, very interesting, where you have, you have civilian vessels supporting a government outpost and a public, we talked about, in the treaty, they talked about the public vessels of the Philippines are covered, including in the South China Sea. And, at Second Thomas Shoal, essentially the Philippines have grounded a commissioned warship there, and back in like 2001. And so, or I might have the year wrong, but around that. And they have a contingent of Marines on there. So that would, that is commissioned warship because public vessels are covered under there. So But yes, very much active, and and you are seeing that combined force knitted together of between all of the different allies. You are seeing this combined approach. Yes.
So go.
Right, I was just going to say, aren't these actions by the countries you mentioned, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia to some extent, also very much are the result of intentional building of alliances and coalitions by the senior level of the current administration. So they know they're going to be better job. They know in accurate what the U.S. intentions are, and they're more willing to commit their resources because of that.
Absolutely, and that kind of alliance building posture and networking the allies together has been a major focus of this administration. And I'd say it does go across administrations, and but that kind of effort to basically bring everybody together, and you were seeing a lot of these kinds of we've been publicizing a lot of these maritime cooperative activities that include whether it's us and the Philippines or us, Japan. We recently did one, the U.S., Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, and bringing more of this network of friends and allies into the conversation. That is the kind of thing that is it is foundationally important, and you build out the combination of persistent and periodic presence, and over time, I think we are seeing very positive results in terms of this overall approach. Yes.
Just want to know the bigger picture about why China is doing this. I'm going to comment look at that, inspect them. Why are they being bullies and behavior?
I'll begin with, I think they're making a mistake. I don't think this is a good strategy for them. I think it's going to fail. I think we are going to make it fail. I realize that wasn't quite your question, but they have a number of compelling reasons why this body of water matters to them. In terms of, you have, as Mark mentioned, there's the sea line of communication through which about 90% of global trade passes. There are questions in terms of, if they're looking for maneuver space for their blue water navy, and they have a number of compelling reasons as to why they want it. I think fundamentally this is their approach of alien. This is something actually coming back to Admiral Ong. I love quoting Admiral Ong, the retired Philippines Navy Vice Chief. One of my favorite points that he makes, and he talks about, actually again quoting David Galula, this counterinsurgency theorist who inspired General Petraeus in writing our counterinsurgency field manual, is that the cheapest and most effective thing an insurgent can do is have an attractive political cause around which to rally and to attract support from the civilian population. And fundamentally, China does not have one. Their only cause is their own self-aggrandizement. And for that reason, if you're a civilian mariner in the Philippines or Vietnam or elsewhere, why would you want to listen to the China Coast Guard, who all they do is bully you, they go and they brutalize you, they take your stuff, they hold you for ransom? Who would ever want to follow them voluntarily? They're going to be completely dependent on these coercive approaches. And so if China wants to get their way, and ultimately, they can have the biggest coast guard in the world. They do, by holes in the water, they have the biggest coast guard in the world, and they will not succeed. As long as the civilians continue to hold their nerve that their livelihoods depend on access to this body of water, and that they are going to continue to sail, and they're going to figure it out, and as long as they have confidence that we are going to continue to build up over time our ability to protect them as they assert those rights, I do not believe China will succeed, and I'm glad to have a hand in making sure that they don't.
So, obviously, first of all, thank you very much. This is fantastic. But given that so much of this rests on that civilian population, and most civilian mariners in this region are fishing, and that up to 40% of Vietnam's global catch is considered to be legal, illegal, underreported or unregulated, wouldn't that give China a similar percentage for China? Wouldn't that give them a pretty strong incentive to offer basically more freedom in illegal fishing operations as a counteraction to basically say that, you know, give China these rights, don't argue against it, and you can have, you know, you can employ slave labor, you can, you know, use all of these illegal techniques, and we won't argue against your catch. Because right now we're effectively still protecting civilians that are already breaking law.
So I think that's a,
Civilians don't care about the law at all, anybody's law. Is that an advantage in this strategy?
So I think that's a really interesting question, and I think you articulate the, you know, China, probably the way that China would probably frame their approach to, like, hey, do you want, like, lawbreakers and rogues and ne'er-do-wells unite? To adapt Marx. I think there is a. I tend to think that there's a, so for the ne'er-do-wells and the illegal fishers, so I think this is a very important point in terms of, you know, the struggle against illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, or I also like what some of these NGOs call it, like, just bad idea fishing. Like, you know, even if it is legal, like, really from an environmental standpoint, this is just not a good plan. I tend to think in the final analysis, when we are working to help build up, you know, one of the main issues, in addition to a lot of the human rights issues that you've mentioned, is what we're talking about is sustainable fish stocks. And so, you know, a colleague who I greatly respect, Greg Pauling, talks about the race to pull the last fish out of the South China Sea, because it is heavily overfished right now. And you look at the environmental destruction that the Chinese have inflicted, whether as they have been fortifying these island basin complexes in the Spratlys, piling concrete on top of coral reefs. I mean, the environmental destruction that they've inflicted is horrendous. So I think our proposition here is, if we can, you know, build up that, you know, the Coast Guard likes to talk about maritime governance and good quality maritime governance to enable those kinds of both, you know, safe working environment for people at sea, to enable, you know, effective and sustainable fisheries and effective management of these offshore resources. I think ultimately that is going to prove a much more attractive value proposition, especially at the government level, because ultimately, you know, the path, that alternative path is basically, you know, predicated on the notion of I'll be gone, you'll be gone, and so will the fish by the time we're all gone. So I think that broader approach, and I also really respect the Coast Guard's approach to this, where they say, you know, we're not going to go after specific, like, we're not saying, when we talk about maritime governance, that we're not targeting specific bad actors. We're not saying, okay, this is really all about X big bad somewhere. It is, we are focused on the behavior. It is, like, we care, like, whoever's doing it, in terms of the slave labor at sea, if it's the overfishing, this, that, and the other thing, we are going to be taking enforcement actions no matter who it is, because these are principles that we support. I think that's a really smart approach. And so I think ultimately that is going to be more effective and more attractive, getting back to that attractive political cause. I think it's going to be more durable.
I hate doing this. I've already let us go over
Thank you,
time. So I'm going to ask for a round of applause for